You're listening to episode 53 of Literacy in Color. Today, I'm joined by two incredibly brilliant educators, and I'd like to even call them word scientists, Rebecca Loveless and Fiona Hamilton. Rebecca holds a background in linguistics and education and has spent 15 years in early elementary classrooms before launching her own tutoring and coaching practice centered on structured word inquiry. She now serves as an SWI coach at the Nueva School in California, consults with schools across the United States, and teaches online courses to educators, specialists, and parents worldwide. Fiona is the founder of WordTorque, a business dedicated to guiding teachers in embedding word inquiry into curriculum and practice. With decades of international teaching and administrative experience, she's worked across grades 1 to 5, authored children's books, and supported schools globally in strengthening spelling, reading, and vocabulary instruction. Together, Rebecca and Fiona are the co-authors of the High Frequency Word Project, a beautiful resource that reimagines how we approach some of the most common yet misunderstood words in English. In this episode, we'll explore the origins of the project, why high-frequency words can be so tricky, and how this approach helps educators and students move beyond rote memorization to deep understanding in the beautiful intricacies of our layered English language. I know you're going to enjoy listening to this one. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Literacy in Color. I am especially excited about today's episode because we are meeting with two well-respected thought leaders in the literacy community that I've looked up to for many years now. To have them together is truly a joy. So first of all, we are chatting with Fiona Hamilton and Rebecca Loveless, and they are co-authors of the latest book, The High Frequency Word Project. So welcome to the show, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I am so curious. I love your educational journey because you do something really spectacular and special, in my opinion, when it comes to literacy, because a lot of people will talk about phonology alone, and they think about literacy more so, I would say, in silos, and we teach these letter-sound relationships in silos. But what you do is you take a really integrated approach with morphology, phonics, and etymology. So what led you down that road?
Well, I think I encountered this approach before Rebecca. So let me start by saying that I'm from Australia and I taught there for some years before I then moved to work in international schools, which for your listeners who don't know about international schools, they set up primarily in countries where the language is not English and we need schools for children in English, or parents want their children schooled in English. And so, diplomats, business people, and so on. So I moved into the international community and have worked in international schools in Asia for the bulk of my career. And I think literacy has always been a passion of mine. And I, like most of us, I think felt in terms of spelling that there was always something, that we don't understand, something missing, because our approach was just to teach about phonics and then exceptions. Here are the letter sound correspondences. These words don't fit. And I actually went to a conference in early, 2001, something like that, where I went to a session. And in 45 minutes, the person who ran this session turned my whole understanding of words and how they work upside down. Like I walked out of that going, oh my gosh, there's a system. I didn't know there was a system. It makes so much sense. And that's this idea that we have to look at the influences of not just phonology for letter sound correspondences, but morphology and etymology. So looking at the structure of words and the relationship between words and the history of words. When we do that, then we can explain so many words, and now we don't have to have all these exceptions. So that was really my starting point, and I've been on a journey for the last 25 years to continue finding out more about it and helping teachers to understand more about how words work.
Well, I am Rebecca, as you can guess now. I'm in California, actually. So Fiona and I have been working together across the oceans. And I started my career as a classroom teacher, very similar in some respects, both passionate about literacy. And it was in 2013 that I also attended a workshop at the private school where I am still working, in fact, and was brought this knowledge that if we don't just consider words by the phonics, by the letters and sound correspondences, and we look at the structure of words, that spelling actually makes sense. And having studied linguistics in college, this was just immediately appealing to me. So I as well have been on that journey ever since to learn more and more about this system of orthography and to collaborate with others on how best to bring this in educational practices and how can we best share this learning with students so that everyone can thrive. I was lucky to be a child who learned literacy easily. And so as a teacher, it was really fun for me. But I was often stuck with the students who were struggling and needed something else. And then I had no idea what to do besides rely on a specialist that was hopefully around, especially in public schools. So it's been a really empowering and exciting journey to learn that there is a system to understand how English orthography works.
Yeah, and I can see just the sparkle and the joy in your faces when you both spoke of that moment of kind of like a word enlightenment, right? The veil has been lifted, and I can see that English isn't crazy, and there is a system. It's just a very complex system, but once you know how it works, there's so much power in understanding spelling and being able to decode and vocabulary and all of that. So we're in California here, and Fiona is all the way in Australia at the moment. So how did this co-authoring collaboration come to be?
Well, it's kind of a fun story. We were both learning and teaching and working within this same realm of word inquiry and orthography. And I was teaching one of my courses, and I saw Fiona's name pop up on my registration. And I had heard about Fiona, but we had never met or spoken. She was doing other things, obviously, in Asia, and I was over here. And so I wondered, what does she possibly have to learn from me? And we just basically wanted to meet each other. And so it was nice for her to show up. And we began talking after the course about our philosophies and how we look at teaching practically in the schools that we work with, and found that we were really aligned. And we also discovered that something we had both been thinking about and that a lot of people had been coming to us about were high frequency words. So if people who are working with morphology are beginning to see that we can study words in families and act, acting, actor, react. But what about all of those little words that we think of as irregular? What do you do with those? And we both knew those words have stories just as well as all of the other words that we can study morphologically. So how could we start to bring those stories to people so that they could understand the nuances in those small words? It's just a little switch that suddenly makes the spelling make sense. So we decided maybe we should collaborate. And the pandemic had just hit and we were all in lockdown. And we thought, well, let's make a little workbook for parents to use at home while everyone's at home. You know, it's just a small project. It'll probably take about 6 weeks or so. And then 2.5 years later, we came out with our first edition of the High Frequency Word Project.
And here we are already on the second edition. And I have to say, it's such a beautiful book. It's like textbook quality, really hefty, and so much great content inside. So let's get into some of the deeper information here. When we think about high frequency words, they're so important to learn. They make up such a huge amount of our written and spoken English. But what makes them particularly challenging to learn?
Well, I think this comes back to the essence of our understanding of words. They're challenging to learn because so often they don't follow that regular letter sound correspondence that we expect. And so teachers have been left with knowing that we need to teach about high frequency words because they are words that occur with great frequency, with high frequency, but how to do that. And so, people have been left with just flashcards, really, because if we don't understand the letter sound correspondences, we don't know why we're using the letters that we do, then we use flashcards, and just learning the word as a whole, which we know is not particularly successful for many students. And so that is really why I think this was the project that Rebecca and I took on, because the phonics is really important in it. The stories help to explain the phonics. Thankfully, with heart words and so on, there's a lot more focus now on saying we can actually analyze these words and look at the letter sound correspondences. But without the story, without an explanation, it's like, so why? Why are we using that letter, or why is it being pronounced in this way? So that interrelationship is so important. And I think another point about why they're so important, why they're challenging to learn, is that we know from, orthographic mapping from Linnea Airy that to map a word for that automatic recognition, we need that three-way interplay between the sounds, the letters, and the meaning. But the meaning of high-frequency words is often really nebulous because they're the function words, the little words in the sentence. And so they don't hold the content like other words. And so the meaning is fairly nebulous and hard to pin down as one of those aspects. So we really worked on that as well, and we'll talk more about that later.
That's really a great way to look at things, because oftentimes when the science of reading is gaining more traction and people are talking about this concept of orthographic mapping, and I feel like the conversation gets stuck connecting the sounds to the symbols and the symbols to the sounds. The meaning aspect is important. We can't map a word that we don't know the meaning of. And it doesn't have this rich meaning, then how's it functioning grammatically? And there needs to be this added layer of meaning in order to make sense of it. So I really appreciate your approach to that. And when we think about these so-called irregularities, because I am very stingy on that word, irregular. I don't like to use the word irregular. But when we think about high frequency words in particular, where do they fit in when we look at the history of English?
Oh, most of these words are some of the oldest words that have been around since Old English over 1,000 years ago. And if we think about why, these are the words that help a sentence flow and help the sentence function, why they're called function words. And so they have been essential to have and very foundational to our language. We know that English has many influences from Latin and Greek and many other things as well. And there are some of the key elements that really keep with that Germanic line. And so some of the words in our book were spelled the exact same way in Old English, and they've traveled all this time to get to where they are now.
Isn't that such a cool journey? It's like you see the word's journey of where it's been. And it's funny because when we consider the different layers of English language, to me, it's almost like the Latin layer is the easiest one to decode. And you make the similarities with a different Latin-based language like Spanish and how transparent it is. And yet English has all these influences, and that Old English layers, a lot of our so-called silent letters, those are rooted in that Anglo-Saxon layer, and they tend to be a little bit trickier. So having a story to tell, to dig into, is really, really helpful. And I love the quote in your book. It was in the beginning sections of your book where you said, don't think of spelling exceptions, think of spelling explanations. So can you unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I very much like to say, because I think that when we talk about exceptions, people just put that aside then. It's like, here we are, I can explain this word, I can't explain this one, it's an exception to the rule. And so therefore they do nothing further with it. That's where we're taken back to just learning with a flashcard or just sort of putting that aside. it doesn't help people to dig in. But whereas if we talk about, oh, it's not an exception, but it does need an explanation, because as you said, Michelle, our spelling system is complex. And so the more we can explain, the more we can help people to understand, the more they can pass that knowledge on to students and make sense of words. So if we think of it needing an explanation, then we have to look into, well, maybe the history of the word is something that if I find out about that, that will explain those silent letters or what we think is really irregular in a word.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm really admiring Rebecca's background as a linguist, because I wish I could go back in time and and have went that route. But I always like to encourage teachers, like, you don't have to be a linguist to do this work. It's like you need the resources to tap into to find out these stories. And gosh, if I could look at my search bar history, it's like Edam Online on repeat all day long. But to have a resource like yours that actually really gets deep into, I'm wondering about a particular word, let me look into where it comes from, I think is really helpful. So you talk about the power of storytelling when it comes to your high frequency words. So why do you think stories are particularly powerful when we're exploring our high frequency words versus just memorize this word from a flashcard?
Yeah, I'm so passionate about this topic now. Probably we all have heard and we know that humans are wired for storytelling. That storytelling is something we've been doing since before language, written language existed. Stories engage our emotion. And when we're emotionally connected, our attention is available. And so storytelling is the medium through which we do a couple of things. One, we're getting children's attention to be focused on the word that we're talking about. And the kids will sit with, they'll sit with rapt attention for any story. And when we started sharing these stories, we'd go into the classroom the following week and the kids would say, "Are you going to tell us a story? Tell us a story." And you could just see that's the enlivenment, the excitement and the enjoyment that they're getting. So why do we tell these stories? What we have aimed to do is look into the deep etymology, which is sometimes a bit overwhelming for people if they're not used to working with etymology and understanding how all of these journeys took place. What we did is we did all that hard work and simplified these stories down into developmentally appropriate ways to share with young children. So it's exactly what Fiona was saying. When we look at the grapheme phoneme correspondences and they don't match up the way that we think, or they don't have a link that has been taught yet in the scope and sequence that people are following, we think, well, we probably shouldn't teach that, or we shouldn't talk about that, or maybe we don't even understand that. But it's these stories that explain why those spellings are the way they are. So a quick example in the word was, why is it an A instead of a U? Because in Old English, it was pronounced with a short A sound, ah. And if we just tell a teeny tiny story, we can provide an anchor for students to both remember, but also to trust that there is logic to this system. And when they encounter other words in the system, they will know, even if they don't know the story, even if the teacher doesn't know the story, that there is a logic somewhere that can be investigated and that we can learn and we can trust the regularity of English orthography.
And I'm just going to interject there to say, and Rebecca's saying, why is there an A instead of a U? Whereas in Australia, children would spell that word W-O-Z because we pronounce it like it's a short O. And so again, that comes back to accents. We're going to pronounce those vowels differently with different accents, but we can't just spell the way we think something sounds. If we learn the story, we have to look at the spelling, because the word is spelled the same way in both countries or all around, anyone who's using it English, writing that in English. And so accents aside, the spelling is consistent and there's a reason for the spelling.
It's been very eye-opening to work with two different versions of English throughout this project, and also to consider students for whom English is an additional language and how much they need the stories of these little words that don't hold very much meaning in particular. Fiona and I have challenged each other on a variety of sort of phonology concepts and, well, how do you pronounce that? And it's been a lot of fun to really tease apart, well, but why is it spelled that way?
Yeah, and I think that point about children who don't have English as their first language, our multilingual learners, we so frequently give no attention or very little attention to these function words other than just learning them, but not how they're used. That idea that the meaning is nebulous and we need to put them into sentences and we need to focus on them. And we really got feedback from so many teachers when we were trialing this, that it's these children in particular who are really benefiting from, oh, that's how you use that word, because we typically don't focus on them.
And I am so glad that you mentioned the part about accents. And so many times our sounds are so subjective based on who's doing the speaking. And, Fiona, I could listen to you speak all day. I just think you have the most beautiful voice. But even in the States, I was just traveling in Wisconsin and they pronounce things differently than I do. And, we all speak differently, but to know that no matter how words are pronounced, that the spelling is consistent. And I often will hear arguments like, wouldn't it be nice if we could just spell words more phonetically and change the system and change all the work that Webster did so many years back and alter the way that words are spelled? But it's actually a beautiful thing that we do have this consistent spelling and that we aren't just tacking on to those letter sound relationships and how that really helps solidify the meanings of different words. And Rebecca, in the beginning, you talked about eliciting our students' attention, and I really appreciate the tip of the hat to attention as well, because you can be the most intellectual, knowledgeable teacher out there, but if you're not captivating them from the beginning and gathering your students around with the eyes wide and the gestures, like that special storytelling of calling in their attention, I think that's a really important component to this work. And I also love that you talked about this idea of having students trust the system, because so many times when students are struggling with words, if I had a dime for every time I've even used the adage like, oh, that word just doesn't follow the rules, or English is just
crazy.
English is crazy, right? But for them to know that there's a logic to this work, I think really helps them in their work too. So I love all of that. You already alluded to one of your tales with the word was, but maybe we can walk through another tale. So can you tell us the tale of a particular so-called irregular high-frequency word that some people may classify as having irregularities, but actually has this beautiful logical explanation if we're taking into consideration history or morphology?
Sure. Yes. It was hard to choose, of course, which one we wanted to tell.
Well, you have so many words in the book. Gosh,
do have
130
words. Yes. Originally 100. And then we added to it because people kept asking, what about this word? What about this word? So we went a little further. Well, Fiona and I were talking about the word no. And it's so perfect that we were just saying that argument. Well, what if words could just be written down how they sound? And if I just say no, which no am I talking about? And if they were spelled the same, that would be a little bit confusing as we're reading or looking at words. So I'm thinking about the word that's spelled K-N-O-W and the past tense as well. We'll put them together of new, which is also a homophone, K-N-E-W. And there are quick ways that we can tell these little stories. We can know that words that have the KN digraph, where that K is not spelling any pronunciation, came from Old English. They have an Old English origin. Often in Old English, they were spelled CN, in fact, but they were pronounced in Old English. So this word would have been canoe if it were spelled the same way, or canowen or something like that in Old English. So when we look at a word and it's got a silent letter and we think, well, why can't we just throw that letter out? There's a reason for that letter. And if we know, oh, anytime we see a word with a KN, that comes from Old English. It used to be pronounced, but it's not anymore. But we still keep the spelling to show the connection to that word's history. And of course, if we didn't have the K in this word, it would be the word now. So we'd run into even more trouble. And then the past tense, people often, well, that's an irregular past tense. And you're saying you like to reserve the term irregular. I love that. This verb follows another pattern of very old words that are derived from Old English, and they're called strong verbs. And they're called that because they had a different way of marking the past tense, which was just changing the vowel. And they're strong because they resisted that typical form of what's become our ed suffix. So this whole collection of what we call irregular verbs, most of them fall into this category of strong verbs, and we can collect them. And I've done this with 4 and 5-year-olds through their oral language and just look at how, oh, well, what changed from no to new? Oh, the vowel. From run to ran, the vowel. So that's a quick version of 2 words actually that belong together and share that meaning.
And I think if you have speakers who have Northern European languages, Germanically based languages, then they will often pronounce that KN. And so you can ask children from Germany and from the Netherlands and and Scandinavia, and they will have words where they're pronouncing it. In fact, I did a post on this. It's on my website some years ago, and I had people from different countries pronouncing the word knee, as in KNEE, and you can hear them saying the KN, whereas in English, we don't say it anymore. So again, that story just really helps children to connect with, oh, that's Old English. It's not so. It's not an exception. We needed an explanation. And now we have the explanation, we can better understand the spelling.
And how fun for our students. And I'm sure they would practice saying those words with the K sound in the beginning.
That's so fun, right? They're all like, I'm going to knock on the door and I'm going to, knock on my knee and so on. And that's great fun and engaging. As Rebecca was saying, we need things to get our students' attention.
And why not have a little bit of word play? We love to play with words. And now we're bringing, again, that enlivenment and attention into the classroom.
Of course. And I love how you talked about doing that activity with oral language as well. And when I read that bit about the strong verbs, that was new learning for me. I was very excited to learn that and to know that, well, if we have the word run, we wouldn't say runned because that would have been an Anglo-Saxon word and it was a strong verb. And for students to know, that's a strong verb. And then we say ran instead. So that can apply across so many different contexts. And I think that that's the beauty of this work as well, because some teachers might get overwhelmed with the feeling like, oh my goodness, I need to learn all of these stories of all of these words. But we'll see the same linguistic patterns used across words. And it's about seeing those patterns, whether it's for no, or if it's for another verb that has a different spelling when it's in the past tense. So
for sure. Think of those strong words. You could go off with your class now and just be looking for all these words that don't have an ED. And of course, they're so common with our younger speakers because that's why they're strong verbs. They're used so frequently. And so, you've got swim, swam and run, ran, and just endlessly. You can have so much fun gathering all these words and looking to see, it's the vowel that changes in these words. That's how they used to mark the past, not with the ED in the majority of them.
And it's also a support to young children's oral language, where we know that young children overgeneralize with the ED and haven't taken on some of these past tense forms yet. But now it gives them an understanding of, oh, okay, now I hear this category and it's not just that I don't know how words work, but they can have their attention drawn to that too. And now we're working with oral language development, which we know is so important.
Oh, and our multilingual learners who didn't get, when a 2-year-old says, I runned across the grass, parent says, you were so fast, you ran, and they just learn this. But if you didn't have English when you were younger, then of course they seem so irregular. They seem so difficult. And again, the explanation is going to help our multilingual learners to understand about these verbs that don't use ED.
Yeah, and that there's more than one way to mark a past tense in our language. And thinking, there were times I would be designing activities for some of the students I'm working with, and even just looking at so many of our CVC words, and like you said, swim and swam, so many of our closed syllables. It applies to so many of these words. And so talk about applying morphology and, structure into phonics instruction. You could do this work inside decodable text and a lot of the phonics instruction that you're doing. It's just another layer or another step that you would take. It's not something additional. It's just the interconnection. So I think that's really great. Like you mentioned, we have 130 words here. Can you just share briefly how your book is formatted for those who don't have this treasure in front of them?
Sure. I'll take you through a page in the section that contains the word information. So basically, at the beginning of the book, there is some background information on orthography. Then we have our 130 word lessons. And after that, we include a teaching plan, an assessment, as well as some word lists to help you plan activities, word cards, games, and things like that. But the word pages are our favorite, of course. So when you open up the book to a word that you want to learn about, you'll see at the top sample sentences and phrases. And this is reinforcing what we're talking about here about understanding the meaning and usage of these function words, where we're not going to provide a definition, but how do we use these words in sentences or in phrases? And we discovered that some of these function words actually have a few different usages that we hadn't thought about. So it's really interesting to expand children's understanding of the many ways that these words are used. And we know that sentence level work is very important these days as well. And we definitely believe in that. So starting with the meaning, right? And anchoring that meaning is what we do. Then you will see the tale of the word's history, including the root and the language of origin. We have also included a section of words that are related and share a family. Maybe they're very closely related. We like to use the family metaphor for word families. So very close brothers and sisters, immediate family, some words that are cousins that have a slightly different spelling, but still have spelling connections and do share an origin. And then we also include what we call foils, or the words that do not belong. And it's really helpful for students to have something contrasting to see, oh, yes, well, the word whale is definitely not in the family of what, even though they both have a WH and an A, thinking about meaning and reinforcing meaning. And then finally, we have our look into the letters section where we give a little bit more information about the phonics, so to speak, and especially those surprising grapheme phoneme correspondences, how you might describe them. And we use the International Phonetic Alphabet, the IPA symbols, to represent the pronunciation. And we like that because it's very straightforward, and sometimes there's some confusion with the phonic symbols for sounds. And so that's a practice that we have. And then finally, we have an annotation of the word that shows how we would analyze the phoneme grapheme links, and shows how, what we will tell you about where we do tap spelling to reinforce the spelling of the word, and to show if that word is just a base or if it's a base with something else, because keeping morphology in the mix is really important, even if the word is just a base. So each word page is like a little bite-sized professional development for everyone to open up and learn a lot of different things about each of these words.
It's definitely a treasure trove. I was like, oh my goodness. And I was telling, I believe it was Rebecca, as we were messaging back and forth, I started compiling some of this information about some high frequency words over the years, just for myself, for different trainings I've done. But this is very, very extensive and such a powerful resource. And it's really incredible. If anyone can take a look inside, it's really, really special. So kudos to you both in putting this out into the world. And you alluded to some of your routine as you were speaking, but you have outlined a 3-step process to take into consideration when you're teaching some of these high frequency words. So can you maybe share the bullet points of those 3 steps with us, and maybe your intentionality behind why those are important in your routines?
Sure. So we really looked for something that I think teachers can have in their mind about when I'm needing to teach. There are a lot of things going on. Rebecca just talked about, we've got the sentences, we've got the tale, we've got meaning game, or we've got these closely related words, cousins, foils, we've got the phonics. There's a lot going on. And I think for teachers, sometimes it's like, oh, I've got to teach all of this. We were really searching for a way to make that clearer and cleaner for teachers. So this 3-step teaching process is anchor, analyze, and practice. So telling teachers, first of all, you need to anchor the meaning. What we mean by that is like tie down the meaning of those words. So don't look at the letter sound correspondences as your first step. Think to yourself, I need to anchor the meaning. The simplest way to anchor the meaning is to just use it in a sentence, because as we said, the meaning of these words is often quite nebulous. I can't, if I'm teaching children about the word play, we can easily talk about the meaning of play and everybody has a picture in their mind. They're experts at playing. But, the word was or the word in, it's a little bit more challenging. So we can just start by using that word in some sentences and some phrases. And as Rebecca said, we did the heavy lifting there because often, you think, oh yeah, I need to anchor the meaning. I can think of one sentence maybe, but we did the work to see how the words are used in different contexts, in different sentences. And so we put examples there. You don't have to worry about your mind going blank. I can't think of more sentences. You can just read some of our sentences there. So anchor the meaning is really tying down that meaning of the word. And of course, telling the tale further adds to that, and playing what we would call the meaning game, where the children are sorting close family from cousins and these foils. All of that is about really giving meaning to these words. And then the next step is to analyze the word. And so, Rebecca, why don't you talk about analyzing? We'll tag team.
Sure. This is the part where we think about the phonics, and we're looking at explicit teaching for helping to orthographically map the spellings of these words, because we know that's really essential for our learners as they're trying to make these words automatic. So we're looking at the word itself and often just naming that this word is a base, the word on or was or what. And then we can look at how the graphemes are functioning in the word and the phonemes. And we can give an explanation for these correspondences even when it's unexpected. And that's the beautiful part that the tale and looking into the letters are doing. Versus just pure memorization, now we're building understanding like we talked about earlier. So this is that part where we're going to look at those mappings and we're going to have the children understand the phoneme grapheme correspondences and work to practice those and then to begin to write those. And then just that little bit of morphology as well. So everything that you think about the phonics of the word is encapsulated in that analyze section. And then we know that practice is essential. So I'll send that back to Fiona.
Yeah, I think that so often we think when we've taught a word or taught a concept and we maybe have 1 or 2 lessons on it, then it should be cemented. And I think if there's one thing the science of learning is really helping us to understand is just how much practice students really need. Obviously some more than others, but that's essential, I think, for really mapping the spelling of these words. And so one thing that I think that we do, which is perhaps a little different from some other people, is that we really emphasize both sounding and spelling. And when we say spelling the word, we mean by the graphemes, by the letters. And so we really go backwards and forwards between sounding out a word and then spelling it. So if that word no that we talked about, we would be sounding it out, O, and then when we're spelling it, we talk about tap spelling. So we're going to do one tap for each of the graphemes. So it would be KN, OW. So a tap for the KN and a tap for the OW, so that we're really cementing what are the letters that we are using to spell this word. We're not just relying on children writing it, so having that visual modality and still sounding. We're actually practicing spelling by the graphemes. So not KNOW, but KNOW. And again, for engagement and attention, we have the children, particularly the younger children, tap spelling. So they use one hand and tap on their arm or on the table, one tap for each grapheme. So that is very important part of our practice is the sounding spelling to promote that mapping of the spelling of the word. And lots of games, of course. And the book has lots of games and activities in the back of it that you can play with your students. And I think, honestly, knowing that we need to practice a lot, take all the games that you are familiar with and that your children love, but just up the level a little bit. Instead of just reading the word, have them spell the word as well as reading it. You're playing Go Fish and I want the word no. I'm going to say, do you have KNOW? No. And then we're practicing that spelling at the same time that we're playing a game.
Yeah, I love the sentiment that when you're teaching spelling, you're teaching reading, and they're not necessarily the inverse of one another because spelling requires
Mhm.
that retrieval. And it's so much more difficult than just lifting the words off the page where you have the symbols right in front of you. You have to bring it out of your brain. So anything to solidify those spelling patterns, I think, is really important. And I love how you're toggling between sounding and spelling as well, because so many times students will just put the random letter string together, but when we can see that KN is a chunk and that OW is a chunk and they're
Mhm.
consistently chunks in English, that's going to be what's stored in the brain. And it's all operating on how the brain actually is remembering. So it's really intentional. I love it. A lot of times, educators will teach high frequency words through memorization, and whether it's through flashcards or other modes of memorization, even popular methods now, which will look at the tricky part and say, well, you only have to memorize the tricky part. It's still requiring a tidbit of memorization here. But why is this act of just memorizing, you think, problematic? And what do you think your approach offers as an alternative?
Yeah, we know that students, particularly those who have poor visual memory, are really going to struggle with memorization, even if it is just that one part that we can't explain. So every time I would see people doing great work and doing their best, and I didn't have these understandings before I started coming to this work. So teachers are left, well, what am I to do? I don't know anything else that there is to do. So just honoring people working really hard. But Fiona and I would see these lessons being done inside. We're just itching because like we know I can help you. I can explain this word and take it to that next level, both for teachers and especially for students. So removing any need for memorization without understanding is, I think, really essential, particularly for our students who struggle. And the memorization element also passes over that vital information and anchoring the meaning and fully analyzing the word. And so, students can look at a spelling of a word and they can practice it, but if they're actually not sure how to use it, there's a missing piece there when they're going into connected text and even in oral language. So pulling these words out into isolation, you're not getting the biggest bang for your buck, right? You're going to have to keep doing over and over and over. And like we were just saying, with sounding, students will learn they can read all these words, but they still can't spell them. So bringing the understanding in, practicing with the tap spelling, having that memory as much as possible. And then it's not like telling the story helps a student necessarily remember a spelling in one go, but then knowing, then we do have to practice. But practicing with understanding is different than practicing just by memorization. And of course, when we dive deep with a few of these words, now we know that this takes some time and that in the busy constraints of a day that teachers are not going to be diving in deeply to 130 words in a year. And we talk about that in the book. But when you do dive deep with some of these words, you're really building that broader understanding of the system, like we said. And it's giving students much more than just the spelling of that one word. So you have your phonics lesson going and you're looking at the TH digraph, CH digraph, WH digraph, pull in these high frequency words, which high frequency words map to some of the phonics lessons that you're doing and just bring them in. So once again, like you said, Michelle, it's not adding on, it's integrating, but providing that missing link so that students can more easily acquire what we're attempting to teach them.
Mm-hmm. And in the book, we have the section, the compendium, where we have made those lists for teachers. So as Rebecca was saying, if you're looking at TH this week, well, then look that up in the book and you will see all the words the high frequency words that we have in the book that have a TH. And therefore you'll be able to group them and to study them. Or these groups that we've organised, we're showing phonological groupings, grammatical groupings, so you can look at the words in lots of different ways. Like that final non-syllabic E, that final silent E that drives people a little bit, that there's an example of it needs an explanation. It's not just an exception because it's like, oh, that final silent E makes the previous vowel long. Yeah, it does, until it doesn't, in lots of words where it doesn't. And then you've got this whole bank of exceptions. You can find our list in the book that says these words all have a final silent E, and then you can look at the story of those words, and we'll be sure to explain in the story and looking into the letters section, that built-in just-in-time phonics teaching on every page. We'll be explaining what that E is doing there. How did it end up in that word?
That busy
Yes.
little E, right? So funny. And not to sound cliche, but knowledge is truly power. And it's about building teacher capacity around this. And whether you're going to do all the lessons or not, to have a place where you can look up this information, I think is just really helpful, because sometimes it's like, I don't know the story because I don't know where to look. I remember years ago on social media, Scribble O was getting a lot of attention. And then people were starting to think, well, every word that has this sound spelled O is a Scribble O. And that's not necessarily the case either. But where do I find out which words are Scribble O and which words aren't? And it's a dilemma about access too. So to be able to do the heavy lifting in the history, I think, is just a really beautiful thing that you guys did. And I just love how you talked about like teachers doing great work. And it's not to say that what they're doing is wrong, but there can be an extra layer that you can add to your instruction to just level it up, make it better. And teachers who have been in the game for 20 years, 30 years, like we're always getting better and you were always learning new things. And sometimes you look back at things in hindsight like, oh gosh, I think about that one kid from 10 years ago, this would have really helped them. And it's just about building up your capacity and really honing in on your craft. So I know you both do some consulting work with schools and still are very active in the game. So what kinds of shifts have you seen with students or maybe even with teachers when it comes to teaching high frequency words using this lens of word structure and storytelling and things beyond phonology alone?
I think one of the most exciting things we've seen is the student engagement. So you can imagine, okay, here are high frequency words to learn this week, get your cards out, and students dutifully do their work. But then we come and share these stories and provide these explanations, and kids are making connections and they're raising their hands. And now they have more questions about other words, and you can feel their natural curiosity blossoming. And we know kids come to us with their curiosity, and then maybe in some elements of learning, it feels like it needs to be direct and explicit. And maybe, if we don't understand some of these pieces of knowledge, then, it is just the way it is. And it kind of squeezes out the curiosity for children. But bringing curiosity and engagement back in this way is so exciting. And frankly, the teachers share in that same engagement. Those who have never heard these kinds of stories and are getting to read them and then sharing them with their students and being able to, it's really wonderful when we as teachers can let go a little bit and not have to be the sage on the stage, but admit that we're still learning as well. And coming with that excitement of like, hey, kids, I just learned something new I want to tell you about. And then students see us as learners, and then they have questions and we're co-learning, and the whole room is bubbling. One of my teachers I've worked with said at one point when a lesson was going on and the kids were supposed to be going out to recess, but were lingering behind, she said, it's a good lesson when the kids are bubbling and the teacher is bubbling too. So bringing this kind of joy through understanding, and understanding is what leads us to deep learning. I think this also the notion of both the sounding and the spelling with the tap spelling, we've really seen it help anchor spellings in children's writing in ways that just practicing without naming the graphemes in a word doesn't do. So that's been really helpful. A student, the word they, and we would tap spell, and she'd just go to write, and just that THAY would just flop right out. And I'd say, oh, could you tap spell that word for me? And she got her arm up and she said, THEYO. And then was able to look back at her writing and say, oh, that's right. I have mapped that to not quite automaticity, but I can go back and trigger my learning and my memory. And of course, once students are noticing words in this way, they begin to notice them in other contexts. So you're in your literacy groups and your reading groups, and you come across a word, maybe one of those words with that final silent E, like Fiona said, and all of a sudden kids are saying, hey, wait, what is this doing here? And everyone knows that they've just stumbled upon a great question that can be answered. And so it's just further fodder for continuing the literacy journey, not just in literacy time, but all throughout the school day, in science, in math, whenever you're coming across vocabulary. And, Fiona's often talking about creating students to be word noticers. And that's one of the big passions that we have in bringing this work, is just knowing that you can notice things about words because you also can find an explanation to those questions that you have.
That is so special. And I love this sentiment of being a word noticer. And it's truly like all teachers want to build this word consciousness, right? And have students aware of words and noticing words and interested in words. And when you tap into this kind of work, it really invokes that feeling of curiosity. And I just love how you speak about bringing in joy as well, because a lot of times people think about explicit direct instruction and they think it's dry or they think it's boring. And we can be curious and we can be joyful. And all of that also aids the learning process and aids the retention as well, when, you talked about the science of learning as well. So I think that's really, really great. And when we think about a teacher who maybe is curious and wants to get started doing some of this kind of work, but feels overwhelmed by learning the stories, what kind of advice would you offer them?
I would definitely say use the book. Pick a word that, maybe your children are struggling with, or one that, you flick through and you think that looks interesting. And don't be afraid to just hold the book. I mean, I think I remember as a beginning teacher being told, have your lesson plans. It's okay. It's fine to have them on your lap, to be referring to them. It's not going to stop the lesson with the children. You don't have to memorize it all beforehand. And I think exactly, I was teaching the word favorite the other day, last week, in a classroom in Canberra. I'm in Australia at the moment. And we wrote the tale. We wrote the whole entry. I still had the book open. I didn't have it all memorized. I had the book open for my reference words, and it was totally fine. I was going between the book and then writing on the whiteboard and talking to the children and going back and backwards and forth. And I think that's what I would say. Don't be overwhelmed by thinking you have to practice it all ahead of time. We've written the stories so that we think that you can just read them as they are. But of course, if you're working with very young children, you will want to read it and sort of maybe summarize it or pick out the main points that you would like to make, because sometimes the stories are short, but sometimes they're quite long and quite complex. So choose the part. The most important thing is that children get to learn words have stories. A lot of these words are really old. They have stories. That just adds to their understanding of how words work.
Yeah, I love it. So that message is especially for our type A teachers who want to be perfect and get things the first go around. It's okay to have your references and to take a glance over, and even the most seasoned experts do that. So
Absolutely. I did too. And the fun thing is the words that you tend to teach over time, you'll find that those stories are starting to stick with you. And so you get a few in your back pocket, and that's just the great way to proceed with all of that.
Yeah. And I think also knowing, like, the story is important, but we're not suggesting that you spend 15 minutes telling a story. It can be a minute. It can be super quick, but it is an important part of this interrelationship. But don't sort of perseverate on it and think that you need to keep on going over and over and over it. Just a quick couple of sentences.
Yeah. And I always appreciate how you come from the lens of the primary grades and being developmentally appropriate for children. Because a lot of people will think like, oh, well, this information is too sophisticated for our young learners. But really, it's not if we approach things in a simple way. And actually, maybe 2 days ago on social media, a big account, over 1 million followers, posted a video clip of breaking up the word people and saying, oh gosh, words like these are the worst because that EO is doing something really funky. We just have to memorize that part by heart. And so I jumped in comments and I go, actually, people comes from the Latin root populus, and the O is an historical marker of why we have that O in people. And somebody else comments, well, that's interesting to me, but maybe not my 5-year-old. And I go, well, I'm not saying we have to say people comes from the Latin populus, to your 5-year-old, but we can bring in those word relatives in just a simple way, like, oh goodness, have you ever thought that if a lot of people like you, you would be considered popular, and just making that connection between words and those kinds of things stick. So just having a simple story, and goodness, your book is full of them, to be able to bring to the table to make spelling feel more clear and more logical. So this has been absolutely a delight. I feel like I can talk to you ladies all day long. Maybe we have a newfound friendship over here, because I always love my fellow word nerds who get excited about this work. And I'd love to end our time together with a little just for fun rapid fire question. So I'll shoot a little phrase at you and you can respond with a word or two. So what is your favorite high frequency word to tell the tale of?
Oh, I have to tell why as well. The word the was written in Old English with a letter that we don't even have anymore in English. And speaking of 5-year-olds, they love learning about that. The letter thorn.
I think I'd go with what, because again, the tail, back in the olden days, it used to be spelled HW because they used to pronounce the H first. So wh, and children love that because we can be saying what and where and when. That would be my one of my favorites.
See, this is so exciting. So what's one word that you would use to describe how you would like teachers to feel if they would have the high frequency word project in their hands?
Empowered. Snap. Empowered and supported, because the information is there for them.
Beautiful. Jinx,
Yep.
right? And then finish the sentence. English spelling is...
complex and wonderfully fascinating.
I might say complex, but understandable and explainable. Are they words? Understandable and explainable?
I think they're words now.
Well, that's what we aim to do, right? Is to help teachers to understand and then be able to explain to their students.
Yes.
Beautiful. So this has been so wonderful. I'm sure my listeners would love to snag a copy of the High Frequency Word Project. We'll drop a link to that in the show notes. And for those who would love to connect with Fiona and Rebecca further, maybe you can share where they can find you.
Sure. We do have a High Frequency Word Project channel. If you go to thehfwproject.com, you can find that. I also have courses available in word inquiry and a handwriting style called Real Script. And I am at illuminatewords.com.
And my website is wordtalk.com, TORQUE, which that word talk means to twist. So the twisting power, and words have done a lot of twists and turns throughout time to land in present day English, the power of words. And of course, for me as an Australian, you will notice when I say word talk, it sounds like TALK because they're homophones. So my website, wordtalk.com, and on there again, there are some courses that you can do asynchronously. I also have a lot of cards and charts that I am particularly proud of. And I think that the illustrations, I've worked closely with Tracy Wilcott for many years. I think the illustrations are fabulous. Very proud of these charts because I think they really help teachers to help students to understand with increasing complexity of looking at different graphemes and looking at, all sorts of things to do with word study.
Wonderful. So we can link that all in the show notes. So again, this has been such a pleasure, and I look forward to having you back on the show another time to chat more all about the wonder of words, because you truly have such a deep knowledge base, and it's so admirable. And I am so grateful for all of the work that you do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Yeah, it's been wonderful talking today. You're absolutely right. When you love words, it's just good fun to talk about them.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.